Vamos começar então a sessão final de hoje com essa palestra magna do professor Robert Wade. Depois, sim, claro, que agradecemos a presença entre nós que é usual. O Robert é um regular aqui entre nós, o que é um enorme privilégio, dada a sua estatura intelectual e acadêmica em termos internacionais, né? Nessa plateia, Robert não precisa de uma apresentação longa e nem temos tempo para fazê-la, mas eu só vou mencionar muito rapidamente fatos conhecidos, creio. Robert é professor da London School of Economics, já esteve em diversos outros lugares, incluindo MIT, Brown e outras, na Itália, na Alemanha, etc. É autor de um livro absolutamente clássico sobre o desenvolvimento econômico e o papel do Estado na Ásia, que é o livro que para nós todos aqui é uma referência, o Governing the Market, que recebeu diversos prêmios, né? E Robert recebeu também, entre outros, creio que não tenho todos aqui de cabeça, mas o prêmio Leontief Prize, como Achievements in Political Economy, right? Something like that. E, então, quer dizer, eu só estou dizendo aqui alguns highlights de uma carreira brilhante, extremamente bem-sucedida. Então, é um prazer, uma honra e um privilégio termos o Robert aqui conosco. Eu passo imediatamente a palavra para ele e, se houver tempo, faço um comentário em relação à palestra dele. Ok? Obrigado, Robert. The floor is yours. Thanks.
I will attempt to be succinct and therefore also rather simplistic. I want to present a single line of argument. But to begin with my thanks to these organizations and especially to my dear friend Ana Celia Castro, who I describe in the following terms. And I want to draw your attention to this combination of mottos, which I've just recently discovered. That is the LSE one, know the causes of things, and I particularly like it to go together with, to marry it with the Royal Society's motto, which is take no one's word for it. And the argument I want to address is an argument that is quite common amongst development economists, which gives a bias for hope about global development. And the argument, it can be summarized like this. The starting point is that a great convergence of income and wealth is occurring in the world economy at large, in the sense that what we have called the periphery is catching up with the core, finally. And that this catching up process is being driven by the rising share of global manufacturing, which is located in developing countries. I call them in this PowerPoint DCs. And this catching up via increasing manufacturing in the periphery is being driven itself by the proliferation of global value chains, in which certain stages, the key word here is stages, of the production of final products are located in low-wage sites. That is, G7 firms, I say G7 as a shorthand for the North, or the core, G7 firms are locating certain stages of the production of final products in low-wage sites. And this location of certain stages of production is itself made possible by the dramatic fall in the cost of transmitting ideas. Ideas such as knowledge, technological knowledge, managerial knowledge, quality control knowledge. The dramatic fall in the cost of transmitting ideas, which really began in the late 1980s, or we can say around 1990. And that dramatic change in the cost of transmitting ideas due to ICTs, information and communication technologies, is what has enabled the disaggregation of the production process of final products and the moving of certain stages out into low-wage developing countries. And the point is that industrialization by this route, where a country simply becomes specialized in the production of certain stages of final products rather than in the production of whole final products, is much easier, much low risk, much less liable to political capture than the route that, for example, the East Asian countries such as Japan, Korea, and Taiwan followed. And because it's much easier to become specialized in the production of just certain stages, you don't need any longer a developmental state. Indeed, the people who are making this whole argument don't believe that a developmental state was ever necessary, even in East Asia. What you need, they say, is simply a regulatory state. So that's the summary of the argument that I want to address, but I want to elaborate that argument a bit more, and I'm drawing on a recent book published by Richard Baldwin, who is a long-term champion of free trade, and it's called The Great Convergence. So this is largely the argument that he makes, but a lot of other development economists have made it as well. And the first step in the argument is to identify what he calls the first globalization, or the first unbundling of production and consumption, which began in the early 19th century as the costs of moving goods fell dramatically because of the Industrial Revolution energy technologies. That is to say, first of all, coal and then oil. And at the same time as the costs of moving goods fell dramatically, the costs of moving ideas and the cost of moving people, so three costs, goods, ideas, and people, the cost of moving ideas and people remained high, but the cost of goods fell dramatically. And this was how we got into this core periphery structure of the world economy, where the Industrial Revolution technologies that were developed in the core remained in the core. They benefited core populations. They raised wages in the core above the rest of the world, and that was the core periphery structure as it evolved. And so in this structure, trade took the form mainly of the exchange of core manufactures, final products manufactured in the core, in exchange for commodities produced in the periphery, and then of course later with oil technologies, oil transport technologies, we got more intra-core exchanges of manufactured goods, exchanges within the core countries. Then came the second globalization, the second unbundling of production, which, as I said, began round about 1990 with the introduction, the spread of ICTs, information communication technologies. And the result was this dramatic fall in the cost of transmitting information across borders, which enabled global value chains to be created. And the key point in terms of development optimism was, as I said, that when countries can get into industrialization not by making final products, but simply by specializing in particular parts and components, that is very much easier. As I also said, you don't need a developmental state for that. An example might be Vietnam, which has become an exporter of what are called wire harnesses. Wire harnesses are a type of equipment for bundling together wires, and this little device is used in automobiles, it's used in other kinds of machinery. So Vietnam doesn't produce automobiles, it doesn't produce much by way of final machinery, but it does produce this vital part, which is called the wire harness. But if you compare this possibility with what happened in Korea and Taiwan, they had to domesticate, they had to put in their own territory large parts of the value chain of final products. They had to develop a dense input-output production structure within their own territory. And in order to do that, they created what we know of as developmental states, because the capital requirements to produce these value chains and the urbanization that went with the value chains were enormous. And the state's role was to coordinate and also to give directional thrust to these investments. But all this has become unnecessary. That's the argument today. What is necessary is simply the regulatory state, and I'll come to the description of the regulatory state in a moment. But the final step in this argument, in terms of its bias for hope, is that this process of entry into small parts of the production of final products, this process can go in a kind of flying geese pattern from one country to a lower wage country, and the expectation is, according to this argument, that increasingly manufacturing will move out of China, for example, and China will relocate more and more manufacturing into Africa. So there will be a kind of modernized version of the East Asian flying geese pattern occurring between, say, China and Africa, and maybe China and South Asia. And so this is all good news in terms of the prospects for the catch-up of the periphery to the core. So in terms of just continuing this argument, if this argument is accepted, then the key strategy choices for developing country governments concern not, as in the developmental state, which sectors should we promote, but rather which stages of which global value chains should we promote. I mentioned the case earlier of Vietnam and the wire harnesses. Another key choice for the regulatory state is which countries' firms to look to for attracting inward investment. And here, the fact that even today, after 1990, when the cost of moving ideas, transmitting ideas, has fallen very dramatically, the cost of moving people for face-to-face interaction, such as moving a technician from Germany to China, for example, in order to fix a machine, or moving a corporate executive from Germany to China in order to coordinate corporate strategy, that cost of moving the person is very high. It may take a whole week for such a person to go from Germany to China to have a meeting and then go back to Germany, whereas going to Poland from Germany is very much simpler. So from the point of view of a host developing country, the argument would seem to be, look for firms that are headquartered, that are based in a close by core country. So in the case of Poland, look to Germany. In the case of China, look for, well, I guess China would not be so keen on looking to Japan, but there might be other countries reasonably close by that China might look to in order to attract incoming investment. The point is that so much of these location decisions are governed by the cost of moving people, ideas, and goods. So now I want to give some grounds for pessimism about this bias for hope that you find in the development community. And the first grounds for pessimism is contained in this picture. This picture shows from 1960 through to more or less today. And this is U.S. average income, and this is the average income of various peripheral regions, including, I think this one is Latin America, and this one is China. Somewhere down here is China and Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. And the point is simply that you can see the point, that there is just this relentless increase in the absolute income gaps between the US and these peripheral regions, and the same point would be made if you if you put Europe in there as well. So this is a very persistent tendency of widening absolute gaps. And secondly, yes, so the second grounds for pessimism comes from the answer to this question: how many non-Western countries have become developed in the past 2 centuries? So we're taking a long period of time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And my answer to this question is that even if you stretch out the categories, the 3 key categories of non-Western and countries and developed, so that, for example, you put Hong Kong in as a country, and you put Russia in as a non-Western country, even if you include as many countries as you possibly can to get as large number as you can, the answer is less than 10. Less than 10. And my list would be 7. That is to say, beginning with Japan, Russia, then South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Israel, and how many does that make? That's about it. Yes, okay. Maybe you can add 1 or 2 more, but I do find that very shocking. This is over 2 centuries. It's not since the Second World War. So that's another ground for pessimism. Thirdly, a World Bank study published in 2013 identified in 1960 it identified 101 countries as middle-income countries, according to the bank's thresholds. So 1960, 101 countries middle income. Question: by 2010, how many of those 101 had become high income countries? Answer: 13. 13. And of course, some of those high income countries were countries like Equatorial Guinea, which is to say they got rich on oil, and all the rich was held by the president and his family, and everybody else was dirt poor. So we're not going to call Equatorial Guinea or some others in that 13 developed countries. Again, the IMF did another study using different thresholds of middle and high income, and it found that in 1970 it identified 167 low-income and middle-income countries. So in 1970, 160 low and middle-income countries. By 2010, only 9 of those 167 had become high income by the IMF's definition of high income, and of those 9, 7 were peripheral Europe. Peripheral Europe. So that includes Iceland, it includes Malta, it includes Serbia or 1 or 2 of those other Balkans, and the only 2 that were not in peripheral Europe were South Korea and South Korea and Taiwan. And again, I do find that very shocking. That's 1970 to 2010, and most of those countries were peripheral Europe that got from middle income to high income. But in many ways, to look at GDP shares, GDP levels, can be misleading, partly for the reason that I gave, that is the Equatorial Guinea problem. So another measure of development is this one that you can calculate from Forbes Global 2000. Forbes Global 2000 gives information on the top 2,000 firms in the world, and from this you can calculate the share of global profits in each of 25 sectors which accrue to companies based in different countries. So I'll just repeat that. You calculate the share of profits in each of 25 sectors which accrue to companies based in different countries. And the bottom line is that the US companies are still overwhelmingly dominant. So they have US companies have by far the largest share of global profits compared to everybody else in 18 out of the 25 sectors, which is to say 72% of the 25 sectors. And what's more, of those 18, the US has the highest share of global profits in most of the high-tech sectors within those 25. So most of the high-tech sectors have the highest share of global profits accruing to US companies, not to anybody else. Now, it is true that in certain sectors, some of the BRICS, including Brazil, have a significant share and a rising share of global profits. But in most cases, their profits are connected to the global commodity cycle, the price cycle. And that means that their share of profits is very vulnerable to the commodity price cycle. It's not a robust share. Of the BRICS, the only one which has a clearly robust economy, I say clearly robust, there must be a question mark about this right now, is China. At least China is diversifying its production base much more than the other BRICS are. And I just want to show you this. When I saw this next chart I'm going to show, which is Brazil's export composition, the way export composition of Brazil has changed between 2000 and 2014, so only 14 years, I was really shocked. And I keep wondering what Benedeus and these other elite pilot organizations in Brazil were thinking when they saw this chart. That's the chart. So these are the manufacturing sectors, and the light line is 2014, the dark line is 2000. So you can see the manufacturing sectors have shrunk quite dramatically as a share of Brazil's exports, and the commodity sectors, these dynamic high employment sectors like iron ore and oil seeds, these are the sectors which have grown in terms of their share of exports in Brazil. I mean, this is a disaster story. And so I repeat, and maybe Lavinia can tell us, not after my talk, but tomorrow, what was Benedeus thinking when these trends were unfolding? It's really shocking. And just to continue the Brazil story, I was struck by the way the Western media has sort of turned 180 degrees on Brazil. In 2009, The Economist had a special survey, 14 pages on the Brazil miracle. It was called Latin America's Big Success Story. And then in 2015, the Financial Times editorial was headed, Brazil's Terrible Fall from Economic Grace. So what I've done is to indicate some grounds for pessimism about this argument that I set out at the beginning about the great potential of the second globalization for developing countries to industrialize. And so I want to continue this theme by providing some more kind of evidence. First of all, the G7 firms, this is a well-known point, are mostly offshoring the low value-added stages of value chains and keeping the high value-added chains at home, namely keeping research and development, design on the one hand, and marketing, distribution, retailing, branding. All this is being kept at home, and it's the assembly operations that are being offshored, and the assembly operations are subject to intense competition, so that if a producer in Brazil says, for example, I want Gap or Next to raise the price I'm paid for the jeans that I'm making, if Brazil is still making any jeans at all, rather than having them made in China, then the Next or Gap or the other retailer will simply say, sorry, I'll move to Bangladesh because I can get these jeans made in Bangladesh for much lower than you are charging. So the point is there's intense competition in the assembly stages of these offshored global value chains. And I was struck by the fact of what has happened in terms of the Intel plants that were established in Costa Rica and Vietnam. when Intel announced that it was investing, and in fact when Intel did invest in putting big fabrication facilities and other related activities in Costa Rica and in Vietnam, this was held up as just a sign of much bigger changes that were coming across the developing world. If Intel was moving to Costa Rica and Vietnam, then all kinds of other high-tech activities would surely follow. Well, the sad thing is that Intel last year closed down the facility in Costa Rica, and this year it's announced that it's cutting back its facility in Vietnam. I don't know much about the background to all that, but I do think that it's a cautionary tale. Intel is reshoring, is onshoring, it's bringing activity back to the US. Or another thing that's happening is that foreign firms are putting high value-added manufacturing in developing countries, but they are putting it in the form of enclaves, export processing zones, for example, which have little spillover effect into the domestic economy. And a case in point would be the island of Penang, which is in Malaysia, which has a whole lot of big brand name foreign firms producing there, but it has very little spillover into the rest of the Malaysian economy. And another thing that's happening is that information technology, while communication technology has allowed unbundling, the dispersal of global value chains, information technology is making it possible to bundle up things that were previously unbundled. What I mean in particular is 3D printing. 3D printing of manufactured goods is now beginning on quite a big scale, where it's possible for a 3D printer to make complete manufactured goods without having a global value chain to make various of the parts and components. Everything is made in one place, and this is increasingly being placed close to the big consumer markets. Some of these may be developing countries, but mostly they're countries in the West. And this is having, I think, is going to have very disruptive effects on global trade and on the possibilities for developing countries, especially with small consumer markets, getting into in the industrial sector. And another thing that's happening is that there's growing pessimism in the core about what was a conventional wisdom. Until very recently, the conventional wisdom was there's no problem about letting the factory jobs go offshore. All we have to do is make sure that the knowledge jobs stay onshore, and then the factory jobs can go anywhere, it doesn't matter. And what we also have to do is push for free trade agreements, because then we can easily import the products that are made offshore. And this is, skepticism is not being driven just by Trump and the people who are supporting Trump, but it's also economists, business leaders, innovation experts who are recognizing, I mean, if Mariana Mazzucato, for example, was here, she would be emphasizing this point, that innovation is a function of a pre-existing ecology of supplier-customer relations, where experience builds upon experience. It's necessary for innovation to be closely connected to the experience of production. And the second thing that is driving this whole process of reshoring is realization that the startups, the knowledge-intensive startups, don't create much employment. It's the scale-ups that build upon the startups that create the employment. And as the political pressure for better jobs rises in the core, so there will be pressure to reshore things that were previously offshored. Okay, and this point, this next ground for pessimism is something that I want to emphasize, because I think it's not generally known just how much pressure is coming from the international organizations controlled by the G7, that's the World Bank, the IMF, and especially, and not very well known, the OECD, for developing countries to adopt the model of the regulatory state and explicitly not the developmental state. And I just want to elaborate this a little bit. The World Bank has been pushing what it calls the good governance agenda ever since the 1990s. And this good governance agenda is basically the agenda of a regulatory state. And the OECD has been pushing in the same direction also since the 1990s, not just in the OECD's 34 member states, which are the rich countries, but also, and this is what I didn't know until fairly recently, also the OECD is very actively engaged with many developing countries. In fact, it has regular participants from 80 countries taking part in its 250 or so committees, and on top of those committees there is this group of Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, which the OECD has called key partners. These key partners sit on a committee which advises directly the Secretary General of the OECD. So Brazil has a representative on this committee, as do the others, in regular contact with the very top of the OECD. So through this kind of network organization, the OECD is pushing this model of the regulatory state. And the central point of this model is that states should have the role of maximizing the scope for the private sector. So a whole lot of activities that have been commonly regarded as public goods, like education and health, should, according to this, be privatized. And the second thing, so the first step is maximize the scope for the private sector. The second key thing for the state is to ensure that these private sector providers compete with each other. So there are two steps. Privatize as much of what the states have been doing as possible, and secondly, then the regulatory state comes in to push for maximum competition. And the result of this combination of private agents competing with each other will be maximum efficiency in the delivery of public services and everything else. That's the key idea of the regulatory state that the OECD is pushing. Where did these ideas come from? They're derived from new public management, from neoliberal economics. In 2005, the OECD published what it called the Apec OECD Integrated Checklist on Regulatory Reform. So this document, you can find it on the internet, it gives a great long checklist of the key things that constitute a regulatory state. And what is important is that the key features of the regulatory state are very much against the idea of or the features of a developmental state. For example, this checklist says quite explicitly that things like infant industry protection are not allowed, import substitution not allowed, state-owned enterprises not allowed, public procurement which favors domestic firms not allowed, directed credit, targeted credit not allowed. So the OECD is very active in pushing this model. So let me just conclude then. My first main point is that we should be cautious about accepting the argument that Richard Baldwin, as one of many, promotes, that the second globalization using global value chains is a good route for developing countries to industrialize. And for just for one reason amongst many, there are these technologies that are coming on now, such as 3D printing, but also technologies like telerobotics and telepresence. Telepresence means super Skype. All these may be having the consequence of reshoring, of reconcentrating high-tech industrial activity in the core countries, and therefore perpetuating the core periphery structure of the world economy. So I come back to a conclusion that developing countries really have to look carefully at the way that Korea and Taiwan and some of those other earlier development success stories were able to be successful, and to take into the future features of the developmental state model that they were able to institutionalize. But this will involve a great deal of resistance from the powerful organizations in the core and their international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF. So there will be great fights about this, and one of the interesting questions then for Brazil is what will the relevant parts of the Brazilian state be doing, such as Benedeias. So on that note, I will finish, except I can't resist just one more minute. I referred earlier to where these second globalization ideas, the ideas of the regulatory state, came from. And I mentioned that they came from this paradigm called New Public Management. And I just wanted to tell you what happened when I came to Brazil for the very first time, which I think was around about 1990. It was when the person who has become my good friend, somebody I have come to greatly admire, emphasis on that particular verb tense, Bressa Pereira, was Minister of Public Reform. And I was invited by Ana Celia and Antonio Castro to give a talk on public reform, but I was expected to talk about how India and Korea were managing their irrigation systems, their big public irrigation systems. So they were providing the same service, but India and Korea were organizing them in very different ways. That was what I was expected to talk about. But just before I talked, Bressa Pereira talked, and he had just come back from New Zealand, and I am a New Zealander. I have been following the New Zealand creation and then the adoption, the implementation in a very revolutionary way of new public management. So I was the only person in the room other than Bressa Pereira who'd ever set foot or knew anything about New Zealand. Bressa Pereira had obviously been captured when he was in New Zealand, and he came back and he talked to this great big gathering. There must have been 300 people there, with a kind of missionary zeal about New Zealand and new public management, and how Brazil had to follow the New Zealand model. He was very, very enthusiastic, very evangelical. Those of you who know Bressa Pereira know that he's evangelical on everything that he believes today. He may change his mind tomorrow, but he'll be equally evangelical tomorrow. So when it came time for me to talk about irrigation in Korea and India, I explained I was going to use just a few minutes of my time to make some very academic qualifications to what Bressa Pereira had just been telling everybody, and which I did. And he was furious. And there looked to be a brewing international rupture between Brazil and New Zealand on the face of this criticism that I made. But I then met him some 10 years later, and I've met him several times since. Unfortunately, he had forgotten all about it. But I can tell you that I had not forgotten about it, and Ana Celia Castro had not at all forgotten about it. Neither had Antonio forgotten about it. This was one of the defining moments of that whole conference. Anyway, thank you very much. It's good to be back.
Okay, so it's obviously hard to comment on brilliant talks like this one just delivered by Robert. And what I will say is that actually there isn't much to disagree with what he said. obviously I agree with everything. So my point or points will be more in terms of what he did not say, and I think could or should have been said. And in that sense, I have to say, Robert, that I was a little bit surprised by the paper's main goal, in terms that the idea was to try to redefine or rethink the role of the state in globalized capitalism. And what the paper and the talk mostly provided was a whole host of warnings about what are the obstacles for development, what are the problems. There's a lot of reflections on development and the middle income trap. There's some on how globalization interacts with that. But there is a very short discussion precisely on the subject of rethinking the role of the state in this sort of globalized capitalism, especially if we focus on this second phase of second globalization, if you will. So, in that, and that from one of the biggest experts on the subject. So that I was surprised in terms of seeing that. But then I think maybe I understood your purpose. You will correct me if I'm wrong. But what came to me is that, okay, this was not exactly a direct intervention in the debate. It was a preface, an introduction, some sort of opening statement to the discussions that we will be having in the next 2 days. Meaning, be aware of all these facts and developments before you get to the main themes. And if this was your main message, then I think obviously it completely fits the function of an opening statement for a conference like that. But having said that, I have a few questions. If I did, it would be boring, right? So we don't want to get bored, especially in the end of a very long day. So I have a few questions that the paper and the talk raised to me. And you begin by saying precisely the very interesting question, how many non-Western countries become development in the past 2 centuries? And the answer is less than 10. Probably around 7, and then Japan, Russia, Taiwan, etc. Okay, I have a first question or a first point here, which is, if we ask a different question, which is, how many did it in the last 50 years, not the last 2 centuries, then we're down to 6 or 5, or to 6, and 5 of them are from East Asia. And China is not being accounted. For a strange reason, you did not account China in that. If you did, then we would have 7, and 6 of them are from East Asia. And that is clearly something new. This is something that we really have to pay attention to in a conference like that. Well, in several conferences on different subjects, but especially in something like that. Why? Well, because we have a different type of development strategy, I venture to say here, a much bigger role for the state in organizing and leading structural transformation. That's your governing the market analytical framework, so that's exactly what you wrote about. And again, you say only a few development countries succeeded in developing competitive industries on their own. South Korea and Taiwan by the 80s being the last. I would beg to disagree with that, because what about China? Again, you're not accounting for China. China did it in 36 years. It is the most striking example of guided, state-oriented, state-led industrial and structural transformation in the middle of the second globalization. So this sort of disrupts a little bit the whole framework that you presented. Because China did it, and it did it right in the middle of the second globalization, and it started, as we all know, from the mess that it was in the end of the 60s, in the end of the 70s, after Mao, etc., etc. So Deng Xiaoping did not inherit precisely a wealthy or a well-organized country. He inherited a mess. And they did it, and China today is the second economy, and purchasing power in PPP is the first, and is the first in almost everything that we think about. Reserves, exports, recipient of foreign capital, etc., etc. So I think this is something that we really should be paying attention. In a way, generalizing a little bit, I think the discussion about the role of state in globalized capitalism has to focus on East Asia and China. And in that sense, all the rules that you point out in the paper, you did not do it in the talk about the public management, etc. Obviously, we don't agree with that, and we know that this would not be the best way to go. But let me then just refocus on like 2 points that I would call them doubts. The first, it's precisely continuing with China and asking you why you did not account for China when you described this sort of successful trajectories and a successful transitioning from underdeveloped for a developed country. And let me just make a footnote here. I happen to think that this unit country is a bit confusing because we have in the US a whole third world in terms of everything, and Trump is a big example, is a exhibit A of that thing. And we have a whole first world inside China. We know that. You go to Shanghai, you go to Beijing, you go to the surroundings of the coast, and it's first world. So it's a bit confusing, this sort of unit of analysis being the country in itself, especially when we're talking about very big countries. But having said that, when you get to China and you use the iPhone case, you say, okay, retail in the US, the profits, and you're very much concerned with the profits. Profits, they were $321 in terms of a profit margins of 64%, and you say, nice work, but value accrued in China, only about 5%. My question then is the following. Is this really the core question from China's strategic point of view? And I don't think so. Why? Because they did not accrue a huge amount of profits, but that was the strategy. In Japan, when they began, in Korea, when they began, in Taiwan, when they began, everybody had that strategy. All developmental states were not so much glued to profits. They were glued to industrial transformation. And that is happening in China. Technology transfer is booming there. Learning by doing is booming there, as we all know. And that's the price to enter the Chinese market. And every corporation knows that, and they pay that price. Furthermore, the leaders in the domestic market of smartphones are Chinese. And they're making already huge inroads abroad. I get you to the, probably you read that, FT February this year, 2016. Huawei, Xiaomi, and Lenovo will soon snatch at Apple's crown. What does that mean? It means that 2/3 of Apple's sales are outside the US. In those non-US markets, Apple, the iPhone and Apple, they are facing already considerable competition from cheaper brands, but cheaper brands offering sophisticated features. So that's the dangerous combination that the Chinese are offering. Cheap, but powerful. Okay, the next three biggest smartphone makers are all from China. And those ones, Huawei, Xiaomi, and Lenovo. So we're not talking about low-end stuff. It's high-end or middle to high-end. Or you take renewable energy. China is taking the lead very, very clearly. $80.3 billion of investment in 2014 against 38.3 US, 57.5 Europe. This comes from the Global Energy Report. Or take robots. Robots. In 2014, President Jinping called for a robot revolution that would transform first China and then the world. And across the manufacturing belt that hugs China's southern coastline, thousands of factories are already turning to automation. That's again a big report in the Financial Times in July or August 2016. And this is a government-backed, robot-driven industrial revolution, and that's from the Financial Times, the likes of which the world has never seen. By the end of this year, China will overtake Japan to be the world's biggest operator of industrial robots, according to the International Federation of Robotics. And it is already starting to manufacture their own robots, and they're buying like crazy robot makers. For example, KUKA, one of the German most sophisticated robot producers, was already, and that's bringing a fuzz in between the German government and China, because, well, why not? If there's no national security rule as they have in the US, forbidding that, then it's part of the game, no problem. So I would say China is really a very big example, interesting example for us to try to learn from. And then I get to my second doubt, which is on your conclusion, the sort of advice that you give in terms of the role of the state. And this is what I referred before, that is a very tiny piece of advice, which is, and I quote you, what is clear is that a developing country government needs to have in place an intelligence function, a modern version of a planning agency, or several such agencies, which continually monitors the world economy for opportunities to bring higher value-added activities to the national territory. It needs to institutionalize a developmental mindset. My comment, that's too thin. Coming from you, it's too thin. We need more. From you, we clearly need more. And then to conclude, if we're discussing the state in globalized capitalism, I'm going to repeat what I said in the very beginning, just in order to close. I submit that the best set of strategic responses to globalization are the East Asian ones. And they are the ones we should try to learn from, especially from their strategic responses to the two crises, the recent crisis, the Asian crisis, and the US-based subprime crisis. And let me just add, for the sake of building up maybe some moment for debates in the next few days, that a common comment is, or statement is that, well, but that's East Asia, is a completely different, and that's a different region. We have nothing to do with them. I would say not really, because first, they are quite a diverse region. In what sense? They include latecomers, Japan, latecomers, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. Latecomers, China. They encompass city-states, Singapore with 5 million people. Islands and archipelagos like Taiwan with 23 or so million people, Japan, an archipelago with it's smaller than California with 123 million people, or China with 1.3 billion people or 1.3 billion people. That's diverse. So it's not one size fits all. We have also British legacies in Hong Kong, for example, and Japanese legacies, colonial legacies in the other places. And very diverse models, again, of trade, openness, relationship with foreign capital. So we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all model at all. And just to give the sort of a touch that I think relates directly to us, we should be studying much, much better the whole Korean experience, because their timing is very similar to ours. They had Park in 61, we had our coup in 64. We had the same development strategies. We had a problem with external debt. In the beginning of the 80s, our per capita incomes were the same. And we had a developmental state with the military. We lost it. But we achieved a lot of stuff. So, there are grounds to sort of think about those experiences. What I think, and I finish there, what I think that we did not have, and they did have, was something very difficult to import or mimic, which was external threats and domestic threats to the ruling elites. This was a common trace in all those cases, and we never had that, or they were never really serious. And the big question then would be, well, how they responded to those threats, how the elites reacted to those threats, and how did they manage to retain and expand domestic policy space. That, I think, is the key question in a conversation about the role of state in the second phase or in the latest phase of globalization. I think those are really the key issues that should not, the key issues, but are among the key issues that should permeate our discussions in the next couple of days. Thanks.
Okay, I am very much even more aware that we are standing between you and dinner, so I will make two very quick points by way of response, and maybe I'll get an opportunity to develop at least the first one at greater length in the next couple of days. Leonardo said China did it, and my short response is no. China is doing it, present continuous tense. I'm confident China will do it, but it has not done it yet. And you see this if you use not one eye, which you're using, but two eyes. You have to use two eyes, and you see that everything you say is correct, but there is a whole set of other sides to it. And that's what you see with the second eye. But I don't have time now to elaborate that point. The second point is this. I lived in Korea in 1979, and I went once to a cocktail party at an embassy, and I found myself speaking to the Brazilian ambassador to Korea, who was an admiral, a Brazilian admiral. And so I was studying Korea's economic development. I was very enthusiastic about what I was seeing, and I asked him just by way of conversation, well, are you and is your government paying a lot of attention to how Korea is doing it? And I never forget the look that came on his face, the look of sort of condescension, in which he said, well, I mean, really, Korea is so small, so Korea nobody really pays attention to Korea. Just Brazil, we are so much bigger, so much more important in the world. And I just thought that this was, let's say, a really unfortunate reaction. And the point that you just made is very consistent with my reaction to what the Brazilian ambassador said. So that's enough.
Okay. Thank you. We're done. Okay, thanks a lot. We're going to be back together in the morning. Okay, thank you.